Hello everyone, welcome to my first video journal. This is Colin Patrick Barth talking about creating Promethean philosophy. And because this is my very first journal entry or update, I guess I'm going to have to explain why I'm doing this, even though, as some of you may know, I've been creating Promethean philosophy for many years, since 1998, and I've never felt the need to do this before. And I guess I can say in the past I've used blogs a lot more. I've used my own websites, which I no longer do. And I don't do a lot of visual work anymore. That takes away from my writing. And I have a lot of reasons for that that I won't go into, health reasons and so on. So I really try to focus the visual time I have on writing, on creating work, books, especially these days. And I don't really have the ability to update people on the web anymore, to maintain blogs, and I don't have a great desire to do it either. So, to be frank, I was looking for an easy way to do this without leaving people totally in the dark about what I was doing. I know in recent years I've gone pretty much underground in a way, and with the exception of a few people who know what I'm doing, I've been working away, sort of almost in secret. And that's a little bit of a shame because I'm really happy about what I'm working on now. And I'd like to be able to update people on current projects. But I don't have an easy way to do that, so this is an experiment. I was actually trying out audio podcasting recently as well as an option. I got about halfway through a very finicky editing procedure and realized I don't want to do it anymore and it's not fun. So, Audacity aside, that's the program I was using. It's fine. It's a fine program. It's just more finicky than I really want to do. I don't want to have to look at a lot of waveforms and edit out bits and all that stuff. I want something that I can do in a very straightforward and lousy way. I know the audio quality is not going to be that good, and the video quality is going to be quite poor, and so on probably, but I'm also just going to talk and make mistakes, probably. It doesn't matter. The point is I'm going to be able to say what I'm doing a little bit and what I intend to do without worrying too much about getting it perfect. I want to save that for what I'm working on, and I am a perfectionist, as some of you know. So this is really just an extemporaneous way of talking about creating Promethean philosophy, doing writing, what I'm thinking about at the time, what I intend to do with it, and so on. So moving on to that. In recent years, I have moved from doing, actually for a little bit longer than a few years, I've moved on to larger and larger projects, working on longer books instead of articles and so on. It's been a long time since I've been interested in doing those things. And one of the reasons is feeling that the internet has changed and not for the better. Another reason, though, is that I really think that the most important work can be done only in larger works right now. I think that there's a dearth of broad education that people really need to think through things. So I'm trying to provide that, to do as much as I can to provide a broad education in what people need to rethink subjects, to reconsider subjects that are sort of, if any, at best, hinted at in a shorter article, in a more consumable article that gets lost in the sort of morass of the internet. So I'm really interested in a sense in more systematic works, but I'm also interested in more literary works that are influenced by things like mythology and writing things like novels and poetry, more evocative styles. So I spent a number of years increasingly working less on web content, um, increasingly working on a large amount of unpublished books. Some of those are still unpublished, um, and some of them are still incomplete. And one that is complete but unpublished is a novel that took years to write, and I'm really proud of it. So I learned a lot doing that. And that was generally finished a few years ago, and that totally changed the way I thought about writing philosophy and organizing a larger project and so on. It didn't change my interest in mythology, in being evocative, and being aesthetically competent as well as intellectually interesting, because I come from a Nietzschean background in which um, philosophy is thought of as an art as well as a science, and style has always been important. Aesthetics have always been very important. So in that sense, it's just been enlarged. But there have been a number of things that I've learned about creating a large project that enable me to think about writing philosophy even more as literature now. So that's a lead into my current project, which has been a major project since 2010. Actually, it stems from earlier work I did, which was called the Promethean trilogy, and I was searching for a way to create a newer version of that for years, and I didn't really find purchase on it until 2010, I believe. And what happened then was it just sort of struck me that there was a particular tone and a particular way of approaching it, which is hard to describe, but when I was in that mentality, I definitely knew it. And I definitely found that a combination of becoming more meditative about it and drawing on mythology and evocative symbolism more, along with the former style I had, which was more of a manifesto. So the first stab at visualizing what I was going for was a 3M style, those three things. And I've broadened that a bit, but that was the first important point of insight that allowed me to really get some serious work done on this project, which since 2010 has changed titles. For a while it was called Prometheus Redux as a temporary title. Now that's sort of a backup title, working title for the project, but as of last year I'm calling it The Constellation of Man, and I think that expresses a little bit better what I'm going for. Although it's not enough to explain the breadth of the project to you, you may see in the end how that makes sense. But it's still a multi-volume work, which was true of the Promethean trilogy. It's just that those are very small volumes, and these will genuinely be full books. So this is going to be a really, really large. Basically, I'm thinking of this as my magnum opus that ultimately expresses what I would like everyone to learn from my work, and what I would like to contribute before I die, and all that sort of stuff. So it's an exercise in perfectionism and in finding maximal inspiration, and bit by bit, in the time I have to work, I assemble inspiration and add to it and edit it, and it's a monumental undertaking. And I've found that many times it's beyond my current state of mind. But that's the idea. It's a combination of goals, to be sure, in between trying to gather together everything I can possibly say that ought to be said, and the best ways for doing that. So it's far too much to explain in one video update, but I'm going to talk about just what I've been doing lately, and maybe that illustrates a little bit about it. Lately, I've been inspired by following the image of Proteus, and I want to explain that, but you can look up the myth of Proteus on a few good websites online and read about that. And what it leads you to think about is what I'm interested in. Applying it as an analogy to, well, traditionally, step one is to apply it to the unconscious. Proteus is sort of standing in for that in, for example, in Jungian thought. But that's just one way of using a metaphor like that. And I mention this to introduce the fact that I use metaphor a great deal in this writing, more than ever before. And one of the reasons for that is that I think it is able to capture more than denotational writing in a very strict sense, if that's a good way to put it. I'd say at the worst, the parts that I work on in the Constellation of Man will turn out to be essays. At best, they will be something like mythology that is hanging in your thoughts and resonating based on symbolism, imagery, in the same way that when you think of the connections you make in a dream, they never get out of your head again. There's something very basic and very subliminal about the resonance coming from these connective images. Or one way of talking about them is symbols, but that's not quite right. Point is, it's not just a word, it's not just a picture, it's a whole octopus of associations coming off something like, say, the sun connecting to thoughts of fatherhood or ruling or light or all kinds of things. So this sort of collective batch of associations coming off of meditating on one image, one name, one archetype in the Jungian way of talking about it. That's I think a lot more pregnant with content, latent content, than a way of talking about some of the same subjects that doesn't make use of those things. So I'm trying to do a lot with that, and Proteus is just one example of what I'm currently working on. But I have used a number of different metaphors throughout these 3 volumes, and I'm adding more all the time, and sort of using them as recurring ways of getting in and out of subjects that are very dry otherwise, and trying to make these as persuasive as a story, as a legend, as a myth, as the allegories and allusions of religion. These subjects, the kinds of subjects that I think are very, very important to get across, and many of the same subjects I've been writing about for years, these are very difficult, some of them, for people to understand as interesting subjects. And, for example, in social thought, there are a lot of socio-political details and so on that people have an idea. People have an idea these are very boring, dry things. And even though some really clever essayists have managed to make them interesting, if you know about those writers, like for example Bastiat in economics. But I mean, in general, you have a lot of horrible writing about some very important topics. You have the serious problem that people would never even open a book to read these things. Persuasive writing is fine, and there's an element of persuasion in what I'm writing, and so is descriptive writing, scientific writing. These all have places, and a lot of what I have to write here is definitely descriptive and there's an aspect of good, clear, explanatory, scientific understanding, but you need to find ways to get people to read these things and to focus on them and to open up to them. And one of the definite contentions in this work is that it has to involve more than just the part of your mind that focuses on the meaning of words. There is a rhythmic aspect to it. There's there are subconscious aspects that involve all kinds of elements that you're not aware of that influence whether or not you pay attention or care or are persuaded or changed by what you read. And one of the basic contentions is that a great deal of this is not only subliminal or subconscious, but that it's also chunked up by what are often understood as unconscious or sort of connective archetypes. So mysteriously, the world is connected by a web of mythic or symbolic associations. It's not just ideas and sort of their statements that persuade people or make them believe things. It's whether or not the ideas that they read connect to their existing networks of associations and symbolism and so on. Something that resonates with your expectations from coming out of a Christian background, whether or not you're a Christian, are much more likely to find purchase in your mind because they match expectations somehow. And that's just one example of many, many possible examples. So that's one of the important points about this project, and one of the ways in which I am really concerned with making it better literature than is usual in philosophy. And of course, as some of you know, I have different ideas about what makes good philosophy from academic writing, and most ideas of what makes relevant philosophy. And I'm very rebellious about that in general, and very Nietzschean about that as well. And I believe in doing a number of things differently. But certainly one of the things that I believe in doing is creating real literature that has resonance along mythic lines, along legendary lines, along storytelling lines. And I got a lot of good practice doing learning about how to do this over the years. And I really think I have a unique style in mind now, so I'm very excited about that. And ambitiously, it's a larger. This has a larger scale than just say a parable. It's going in and out of using central metaphors to the point of having many central metaphors. But I just have to trust myself that this comes together nicely in the end. So I mentioned Proteus, which is a recent focal point. I guess I can mention a few other things before closing it for this episode. I'm working in Volume 2, which is really primarily about the mind. And it covers some of the same ground as a book which I think I will not attempt to finish until this is complete, but we'll see. And that book is about a theory of personality and the mind, which is evolutionary. And if anyone is familiar with Robert Anton Wilson, it's sort of an answer to his model and to Jungian models and other models of personality and mind. It's also an answer in opposition to cognitive models of psychology. And I won't go into that, but that's something I'm really proud of. And in the other book, I talk about it in a sort of style that's more accessible science, something like maybe Bill Bryson or something like that. And that's great, and I can go into more detail on the model, but in the second volume of The Constellation of Man, I want to cover the same ground in a more evocative way and stylistic way. And so that's an interesting challenge. You can't just talk about a new scientific model straight out and get people to appreciate why you made it up and its significance, and what questions does it answer. Why do you care to have a new personality model? And that's not immediately obvious, perhaps, without a lot of introduction. But I mean, of course, one stupid answer is to understand yourself better, and that's, stupid just because it's too quick. But that's really also true. But why? And why is it dangerous to run with existing models? And what's so wrong with, for example, folk models of how the mind works, or Jungian models, or Freudian models, or anything else? The ways people think about themselves, I would contend, are almost entirely wrong. I don't agree with people who sort of think we can, our current findings in cognitive studies can fit right in, and I think that what's wrong almost completely outpaces what's correct. And especially, I think that experimental science has not really been helping with psychology, and that's a whole argument I'm not going to attempt to make here. But in any case, the model isn't something that you can just insert and say, "Bam, there it is," because even if it's largely correct, no one will care in the proper way. So a lot of the challenge in writing into that point is how to make that expected by the time it shows up. So I do a lot of introducing why people should care about a better model of mankind's mind. I do a lot of introducing the questions in volume 1. And sort of basic themes like how to pay attention, which are really essential to any serious intellectual thought and any serious philosophy. So, how to pay attention, I believe, is the first section. Really, it's not called that, but that's one of the first major themes. There's also the theme of crisis that shows up in volume 1, and so on. So basically, building up questions, existential questions that can then be better addressed, better answered, and building up a tension that can be relaxed by having better ways of thinking about it. It's introduced at some point, and that's I'm not just. Overall in this work, I'm never just concerned with what I'm saying. I'm concerned with why I'm saying it and how I'm saying it. So from a lot of different angles, all these things need to be right. And there's got to be, to my mind, a great deal more focus in philosophy in showing the importance of things, why we care about things. I mean, you can't just state these are great philosophical questions to anyone around and just expect them to believe that. I mean, the truth is a lot of questions debated in so-called philosophy are not that important, I think. But existential questions clearly are. And those connect to very personal questions, and very specific questions. And so the importance of things, down to the specific person and their personality and how it applies to them, is something that I think dreadfully ignored. Also, how things are expressed. actually has a great deal to do with what is expressed, in the sense of what gets across to that person. And oftentimes, I think poor writing, poor expression is a way of hiding from the fact that you don't quite understand what you're saying either. And maybe that I can lead from that into a point which I should make my final one here, because I've been talking for 25 minutes, which is that when you're writing philosophy, you shouldn't believe that you already have the answer when you begin. And I think this is a very simple point, but I think it's pretty wild how often intellectuals go into a piece with an ideology that convinces them they already know what they're going to say. They're just going to figure out how they say it. Now, philosophy is a process of thinking. It's not believing that you already have the answers. That's ideology. That's really quite different. This separates people who practice what I would call philosophy from people who practice ideology, who practice not even really substantial intellectualism, in the sense that they're interested in the accuracy of things and so forth. Intellectual conscience would grab you at times and shake you and say, that's not quite right, is it? You don't really believe that. If you were writing a number of things you see on the internet, I mean, written by so-called intellectuals, people who clearly believe they are intellectual, they go into it absolutely stuffed full of an ideology, and they have no possibility of believing they could ever come up with a hard question for themselves in the course of writing any piece. And this really shows, because they're so hardened in a view that they're not interested in having an experience in which their mind is changed. They think of something else. They think of a question. They think of a problem. And I think even any decent intellectual is probably in the course of writing something going to find their minds changing. Not just I don't just mean having an open mind, but I mean being able to accept maybe being wrong. And that's part of that. There's some overlap there, but it's not quite the same thing. An intellectual that's any good at all can hold their ego in check, and hold their fixed ideas in check, and can be wrong, can be able to adjust in the course of thinking. And of course that bridges to more than intellectualism, but and accuracy and honesty and intellectual conscience and all that. That bridges to full philosophy, which is much more meditative and much broader, and is really interested in thinking about things anew all the time, if it's any good. And if you really deserve the label of philosopher, to me, you go into a work of any breadth you like, large or small usually, and it should bring you into a process of thinking, which is something that I write about a lot in The Constellation of Man, one way or another. A process of thinking that should deliver you to something different from when you began. So in keeping with that, I didn't start this project with a list in my head of points to make that I would call Promethean philosophy, and I just want to convince people of them. I certainly had some points in mind that I started to generate and so on, but the more time I spend with it, the more I'm actually developing new and better philosophy all the time. And I've always believed in a living philosophy that's improving and fixing itself and being created and being fleshed out, but also questioning itself all the time. And it's always possible that many of the major contentions that I came up with in the past were wrong in some sense. It's more often I find that they were incomplete or made mistakes, and I want to improve on those. And you have to have the courage to say, what if things that seemed obvious to me in the past or seemed clear were in fact myopic, or I just didn't have a full enough picture. And I certainly have made some mistakes. I think I'm largely proud of everything I've said in the past, but there's always been room to improve. And I believe in iterating through many different kinds of projects and coming up with better things to say and better ways to say them. And I would put my current work up against anything I've done in the past and say it's definitely an improvement. And I think it's important not to rest on anything and not to defend any particular belief just because you've had it in the past. In fact, I'm sure that some of the people who have liked some of the things I've had to say in the past, years and years ago, will find themselves troubled by some of the new ways I have of talking about the same problems and issues and questions. But I'm trying to evoke a thought process in the people who read my work and not just have them convinced of any specific thing. So the ways to do that are challenging, and they are not just repeating what you've heard before and making you feel good and say, someone agrees with me, because that's a waste of time. You should read ideology for that and not philosophy. Philosophy should change you by making you into a more active thinker and a broader thinker. It should give you tools to think on your own, but not exactly what to think. And otherwise, there's really no point in having a future. We're just copying, and there's too much of that. So my way of being a good Nietzschean philosopher or Promethean philosopher is to build on other people's work and try to improve on it and try to develop it. I'm not satisfied by saying I agree 100% with, say, Nietzsche or any of the other influences on my work, Bateson or any specific set of thought. Certainly, I would never say that I agree entirely with anything sociopolitical that's influential on my thought, although I will always admit my influences. But I think it's always important to keep moving ahead and keep improving. And I've always, with that in mind, I've always found ways to do that and keep my work fresh. So that's what keeps me going and continuing to do work even under some of the worst possible conditions for doing intellectual writing. I think present day is one of the least literary environments you can possibly imagine, and it's very easy to have that get you down. And even for commercial versions of thoughtful writing, it's a dreadful environment. But if you focus on the work itself, you'll always be happy with it. If you do your absolute best and pour yourself into it and let it change you, you get a rapport with the work that's just invaluable, and there's nothing else like that. It's the same as the rapport between an artist and say visual work, musicians. You find that when you're interacting with that work, it's a mutual development that's it's like nothing else in your life, and you're at your very best that way, and you feel yourself as almost more than yourself at those times. So that's why I continue to try to be the best philosopher that I can be, and mostly I have to talk about writing as the outlet for that. But it's not just about writing, it's also about doing philosophy, living philosophy. And if you yourself are not the expression of that in some way, if philosophy is something that you can pick up and put down and it doesn't change your life, it's to me it's not philosophy at all. It might be intellectual entertainment, who knows? It might just be a bunch of words, and that's a big big theme, the superficiality of words in themselves. That's a big theme that I have picked up in the constellation of man. But my focus is definitely to keep challenging myself and keep challenging the work to be better and better. And I hope to have many more updates in the future if people enjoy hearing this sort of thing. Other than that, it's nice to communicate with you and talk a little bit about what I've been doing for years now without really talking about it, and basically being underground and not really ostensibly having much to say. I still won't be talking too much about anything that's up in the air about the work when it's happening, because I really want to focus on finding direction in the book itself, and there's a way in which you can sort of expend your energy, that your hunger to get that done, by talking about it instead of doing it. And that's a shame that I think a lot of creative people fall into that. They feel satisfied almost by talking about what they intend to do instead of making it happen, which is a little harder. So anytime there's going to be a question between pouring myself into talking about the work and what I intend to do and actually doing it, I'm going to focus on actually doing it. And I think that's good practice. But I'm far enough now that, having sort of disappeared for a while, I can talk about, I think the last time I talked, in fact, publicly a lot about what I was working on was when I was writing the novel. But so it's been a few years. But I think now I found enough direction with these 3 volumes of The Constellation of Man that I can talk about them, and I have enough to talk about without any serious spoilers. So we'll see. But if I find other things I want to talk about along the way, I might just fire up this camera and fill you in a little bit. So further updates, I hope, and I'll talk to you again maybe soon.